I think what I'm really thinking about is um, how our field is experiencing, um, in general, lower enrollment numbers for graduate student programs. And as we reimagine and like sort of target how we, I guess, the pipelines in which how we bring students through like higher ed graduate preparation programs and ultimately into the field as our future colleagues. Um, like, uh, how many, in what ways can we make sure that first generation graduate student support is a foundation for whatever initiatives that that are coming to mind, that are being developed?
Hello, and welcome to Student Affairs Now. I'm your co-host, Keith Edwards. I'm also joined today by my co-host, Michael Allman, who you'll hear from in a little bit. And today we're focusing on first-generation graduate students and higher education preparation programs. Today's episode is part of a 13-episode series for ACPA's 100th anniversary and a partnership between ACPA and Student Affairs Now. We have two great guests joining us today and a rich conversation ahead of us. Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and online learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays. Find details about this episode or browse our archives at studentaffairsnow.com. As I mentioned, today's episode is sponsored by ACPA, an independent 501c3 nonprofit association, which is sponsoring this special 13-episode series with Student Affairs Now to celebrate its 100th anniversary, boldly transforming higher education. As I mentioned, I'm your co-host, Keith Edwards. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a speaker, author, and coach. And I help empower transformation for better tomorrows in higher education through leadership, learning, and equity. You can find out more about me at keithedwards.com. And I'm recording this today from my home in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is at the intersections of the ancestral and current homelands of both the Dakota and the Ojibwe peoples. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Keith. Hey, everyone. I'm your other co-host, Michael Allman. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm currently a client success and support coordinator at GivePulse, which is a community engagement software for higher education and nonprofit organizations. I'm recording today from Atlanta, Georgia, the ancestral homelands of the Yuchi and Cherokee East people. Let's go ahead and get this conversation started and welcome our guests. So we'll go ahead and just start with some introductions. If you all wouldn't mind introducing yourself, your pronouns, and just sharing a little bit about yourself and your current role as well as your connection to this topic. So we'll go ahead and start with you.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Good morning from the West Coast. My name is Will Shu. My English pronouns are he, him, his. And I have the pleasure of currently serving as an assistant director of residential life at San Jose State University, which resides on the unceded territory of the Thamian Ohlone Thamian Ohlone tribal nation, which is also interconnected with the Muwekma Ohlone tribal nation. And so a little bit about myself and my connection to this topic. My background in student affairs is mostly in the functional areas of like residential life, academic advising, DEI education, orientation, and parent and family programs. I identify as a first generation college student and also the first in my family to enroll in and seek and obtain a master's degree. And I think like my entry point into student affairs, particularly with my identities and my positionality, also includes the narrative of knowing what I wanted to do for graduate school before knowing what I wanted to do for undergrad. Also being growing up and going to undergrad in a particular same region of the United States, and then knowing only that for my life, and then going across the country to a completely different regional experience for my graduate education. I have my master's in Student Affairs Administration from SUNY Binghamton University. And I can share, I'm excited to talk a little bit about how my narrative of how I got into graduate school, navigated graduate school, and now like reflecting on those experiences after having a master's degree, how it all ties to this topic today.
Wonderful, thank you. And Nick, we'll have you introduce yourself next.
Yeah, awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Melendowski. I use he, him pronouns, and I currently serve as the Assistant Director of the Honors College at Eastern Michigan University in Ypsilanti, Michigan, which is the original homeland of the Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Wyandot tribal nations. I attended graduate school for my master's in Bowling Green State University's College Student Personnel Program. And being a first generation college student has always been an extremely important part of who I am as a person. I remember even in undergrad, I arrived to college on my first day, and I just remember sitting on my bed and being like, all right, we're here. So now what do we do now? Because I just didn't know even where to begin in that college experience. As I started going to grad school and started doing this higher level work, I also realized that not only was I a first generation college student, I was also a first generation graduate student as well. So I just really remember these feelings of fear, uncertainty, not really being sure of, kind of like I said, what was coming next. And as I'm kind of sitting here today, I look back on a lot of this with pride and just thinking about how much I achieved throughout my graduate education. And I'm kind of going through that process again now. So I'm getting ready to start a doctoral program in educational leadership at Eastern. And it's a lot of those same feelings that I'm kind of shuffling through again. You know, I don't know what to expect from a doctoral program. No one in my family has really done a doctoral program. Even like my extended family, I'm kind of like the first one really doing this. So I'm kind of having that conversation myself. So I'm really excited to see how this conversation plays out today, because I think it's going to be really applicable to the place in life I'm at now.
Thank you for that, Nick. For both Will and Nick, I really appreciate the little tease to the insight of you being a first generation graduate student. So I'm really interested to hear your narratives a little bit more soon. But before we continue, I just also wanted to mention that we did have a third guest who was planning to join us, but was unfortunately able to last minute. So I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Dr. Jackie Mack, who is an assistant professor of higher education at Northern Illinois University. She was just instrumental in helping us prepare for this episode, but she was unable to join us today. So Jackie, thank you for all your help in making this episode happen. And now we can continue this episode.
Yeah. Well, thanks to all of you for being here. I find this really interesting because I have a really different perspective. Both my parents did go to college, and my mom got a master's degree, and my grandmother got a doctorate at a time when working as a full-time first grade teacher, that was really unusual in the mid 70s, particularly for women. And so as I'm listening to this, I'm hearing some things that I relate to, even having sort of the opposite end of experience and all the privilege that comes with that. But also remember sitting on my bed on the first day, just as you were saying, Nick, like, what do I do now? So I think that I'm really interested in this conversation and the differences and the similarities and what we can kind of evoke here. But Michael, you've been working on this episode and designing and inviting guests and things for a while. I'm wondering if you can provide us a little framing about what do we mean when we talk about first generation college students and first generation graduate students, which is a little bit of a mouthful. Let me try that again. First generation graduate students. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to define what we're talking about for today's conversation, we're looking specifically at first generation graduate students in higher education programs. So whether that be master's or doctoral level programs. We're specifically looking at this population. So a lot of content research is focused on first generation college students, specifically thinking about undergraduate students who had parents that did not go to undergraduate and get a 4 years bachelor's degree. For this conversation, we're looking at those who whose parents did not attain a master's or doctoral level degree. So just kind of wanting to frame that conversation so we all know kind of what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, and for folks who are interested in other conversations like this, we previously had a conversation about first generation undergraduate students on Student Affairs Now, and an episode on first generation student affairs, first generation college students who went on to become student affairs professionals. And so this is kind of sandwiched in between there about the first generation graduate and professional school folks. Both of you kind of alluded to this, but maybe we'll come back to you to open up a little bit more. What are some of the experiences and challenges you've experienced or you've seen others who identify this way in higher ed preparation programs? Maybe yourself, maybe people you have conversations with, maybe some of your peers in your cohort.
Yeah, I definitely think starting with my own experience, one of the most salient experiences that comes to mind is earlier in my intro when I mentioned that I kind of knew what I wanted to do in grad school before I knew what I wanted to do in undergrad as a first generation college student. And just sort of like the quick narrative explaining that. My first year of undergrad, I think it was my second quarter, is when I got got connected to the hall council government for my residential area. And that's when I had my first one-on-one as an executive board member with my advisor at the time, our assistant director of residential life for that area. Um, and I don't remember the conversation, but I do remember her having this little tidbit letting me know that like, hey, you know what I do is a full-time job, right? Um, and like you can get a master's degree in this. And it sort of just sparked my interest, planted that seed that like, oh wow, like I don't even know what I want to do with my college degree. But I know that this is now a career pathway, and I always loved getting involved. And ultimately I find out that student affairs was a lot more about just getting involved, but a lot more than just getting involved. But um but at the time, I still had not yet even declared my undergrad major. I changed my major about four times since that initial second quarter of my first year. And uh, in a journey to find something that would have some level of connection to being a foundation for my eventual like graduate preparation or a graduate degree. Um, and then there's also the like application and piece to graduate school, exploring graduate programs, finding out that like uh, sort of a lot of the origins of how we understand student affairs comes from um, like institutions that resided in regions of the United States that were not where I lived in Southern California. Um, and so that like in order for me to become a competitive candidate for a student affairs career back home in California, I had to really broaden my horizons and my understanding of the field by going outside of California first. So and that was scary for me. I had never left Southern California for the first 21 years of my life. Um, so um, I think like it I don't think I could have navigated it as well as I did. And trust me, like it was I say that, and and as well as I did was also really messy. But it was with my mentors and all of the different professional staff that I connected with at my undergrad across different functional areas who really like helped steer me and guide me into like all the different considerations that I um, was not thinking about as someone who did not have this I guess like navigational capital in higher education.
What was it like for you? You mentioned that you navigated it successfully. Sounds like there were some bumps. What was it like for you leaving home in many ways for kind of the first time that region of the country and going to the opposite corner?
Yeah, so I said in my intro, I did grad school in upstate New York. And I thought that, when you're going to a flagship institution or an institution that's in a city in upstate New York, that it was going to be a little bit more urban than I thought. It was not very urban.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think like understanding regional differences, I think some of the more um, I guess like, oh, what is the term? Um, some of the experiences that really, the deer in the headlights moments came from my experience navigating my positionality a as a queer male of color in a predominantly white institution for the first time in my higher ed experience. And so some of that also included like, um, before I even go to that part, there was also the piece of navigating my transition from being a student to being a graduate assistant, and therefore, like, there's a new professional positionality there
Mhm.
too. Um, Now, and then to come back to what I was about to say, unfortunately, navigating some of my first workplace racism incidents, like
Mhm.
in the field as well. So, there was a lot to navigate from the professional positionality piece. There was a lot to navigate from like the regional adjustment piece
Mhm.
to like a different regional culture in the United States. And then there was also a lot to navigate from the scholar piece of like the actual academics of graduate school. What does it mean to have a faculty advisor? What does it mean to be in a program where it's more geared towards practicum and comprehensive exams and not as much towards um, the thesis type of requirement. Um, and then what does it also mean to like navigate a different I guess like what it also meant to me to navigate a different series of life transitions when I changed graduate assistantships and went from um, opportunities where I could live on campus to opportunities where I lived off campus now.
Mhm.
So um, yeah,
Yeah, thanks for sharing all of that. I think there's all sorts of things coming at you, right? Different region, different culture, urban, rural. Rural is probably not the right word, but less urban. Um, but then also intersections of race and sexual orientation and first gen and all of those things. Nick, how about you? What are you connecting with here? Similar, different? Tell us a little bit about
Yeah.
your journey.
Yeah, I was gonna say I was jotting some things down as Will was talking because it's so fascinating to me how there are so many similarities that I share with Will's story, but there's also so many differences,
Mhm.
but they come from almost the same area.
Hmm.
So, I didn't decide to go into student affairs until my last semester of undergrad. So I was that super involved student. I was doing orientation, pretty much ran our tour program of the university. Just was very involved in kind of like the student affairs side of thing. Um, but I was a communication disorders major, and going into speech pathology in
Mhm.
2021 was not really feeling like that was a good spot to be in. And so it's a blessing that I'm in student affairs at this point. But yeah, I did the hall council thing. Like it was a whole piece of just like my undergrad was doing those involvements. And that's kind of a point I actually wrote down for this question. Kind of those experiences and challenges of first gen students in general, but also first gen graduate students is a lot of my experiences and just conversations I've had with people is we just love to overcommit. We are told that do as much as you can, it's going to set you up for success. Always say yes, things like that,
Mhm.
which in moderation is a great idea, kind of
Mhm.
get involved in different spheres, see what's going on. But that can easily go too much because we don't really know what a proper level of, involvement or proper level of time devoted to classwork. We don't really have like people in our family telling us like what that looks like. So
Mhm.
we're kind of navigating the sphere on our own and figuring out like what kind of figuring out as we go. And by the time you realize, dang, I'm really overcommitted, you're too deep to do anything about it. So I think that's just a really big experience that folks have, me included. Um, and I think that another piece of adjustment that was really hard for me moving from undergrad to grad school, in addition of that mindset shift of, moving from I'm just a student at this university. Sure, I have some leadership positions, but I'm not like a professional on campus. Moving into an actual advising role, working with primarily first generation low income students, it really is this big shift in mindset where you're like, oh, I actually need to kind of change how, not necessarily change how I present, but kind of change how I'm being viewed on campus or change how I'm being viewed by students, things like that. I'm really grateful that I chose to attend Bowling Green's program because I think being in a cohort style program really benefited me. Being able to have students that, or have classmates and colleagues that I shared similar classes with, kind of went through the program together. And what I learned throughout this experience as well is a lot of us actually were first gen graduate students as well. And so I was able to engage in a lot of really cool conversations. I was on our first gen planning committee. Like I was able to just have this really great space where I could connect with a lot of folks. And I think a lot of times when we get caught up in, these experiences, oftentimes it can turn negative or it can turn into like bad experiences, which is valid. I have had my fair share. But I also think there's a huge sense of pride for first gen graduate students. And it's not even like the big things. It's not like, yeah, graduation, we're proud of ourselves. But it's like, I did really well on a graduate level paper, or I really mastered how to use APA. Like, it's like these small things that you kind of gain throughout your college education that can really just step folks up to like feeling really proud of themselves, kind of breaking down those fears, breaking down feeling like you don't belong. So I think that these experiences really can help first gen graduate students like just move forward and kind of find their place, even if they don't decide to like stay at that institution they're at their graduate program for. Like they're kind of figuring things out as they go and it's setting them up for success in the future.
Yeah. Sounds like the big lesson here is committed and involved is great. Overcommitted and over involved, not so great. So we got to kind of get the
Right.
Goldilocks going on there. Yeah. Michael, where do you want to take us?
Yeah, I was actually interested in a quick follow-up. Nick, you had mentioned you were involved in the first gen graduate program organization. I was curious to know if you could expand a little bit about that and kind of just describe your experience of like what were the existing support structures in place for first gen graduate students, if any. I'd love to hear your response to that as well, Will.
Yeah, so the group that I was a part of, so I was a graduate advisor with a scholarship program that predominantly serves first gen low income students. And as part of my grad assistantship, I was able to be a part of the first generation committee on campus, which just meant, putting on different events that are geared towards first gen students, putting together materials available for first gen students, planning like the National First Gen Week, things like that. And for what I did find interesting, I think there aren't enough resources in general for any first gen student on most campuses. But for graduate students specifically, they're pretty hard to find. Like because when resources are marketed at predominantly undergraduate institutions, they're usually like your first semester on campus, come check us out, or you're getting ready to graduate soon, let's get you ready to get those jobs and things like that. And grad students are often left out of that conversation. So in my role and in my assistantship and things like that, I was also a part, once again, getting to that overcommitted bit. I was also the vice president of our graduate student senate. And so as part of that role, I was able to actually put together some different legislation that we were able to present to our president of our institution, being like, there needs to be more support for first generation students, specifically graduate students. And so after that went through, there's actually been more kind of the attitudes have changed, at least at Bowling Green, kind of about first gen students and the different resources that are needed. So I think, they've actually kind of one of the positions on campus is now more focused on first gen supports. I know they're doing more with writing support and doing more with just like making sure that there are folks available as a resource for students on campus, including graduate students. So yeah, lots of different things. A lot of it came down to really just like there needs to be someone who is helping these students out as much as possible, instead of just bouncing them from office to office, expecting them to know the ins and outs of financial aid, expecting them to know the ins and outs of registration, when that's not always the case. And that can be really mind-boggling and can be really painful to try and figure out throughout the process. So all of that to say, there should be more supports, but at least they're kind of on the trend to get more support.
Yeah. I think like I resonate so much with what you just mentioned, Nick. I also experienced like just a dearth of um graduate student specific support when I was a grad student. And everything, I think like even trying to go to the career center at the time, trying to go to like utilize counseling services, but also like having this dual positionality of like I'm an employee in some ways, but I'm also a student, so I'm eligible for these student counseling sessions. Like those were very different things to navigate, as it was fellow student affairs employees like providing these structures, but they weren't necessarily thinking about like our experiences at the time. And so similarly to Nick, like I I'm grateful that a lot of the folks in my cohort were also like sh we shared a lot of that first generation identity. So even though like I well, yeah, all that to say is that like there is still connection points that I had in with my cohort in particularly like what is it? Like the first time we had to do like law briefs for our law and higher ed class. Like most of us did never really had much interaction with the legal system in that formal setting. So we didn't understand that there was a different style of writing there. What is a lit review? Like where can we get help like uh, with putting together and structuring an annotated bibliography? Why does APA format matter? Like why phrase things with a certain style, a certain grammar, a certain tone? Like this writing, this style of communication doesn't come um, naturally because it's not something that like we were ever uh, conditioned with. Um, and so um, yeah, those were some of the things that like in grad school, because there weren't so many like academic resources targeted for graduate students in my experience. I found that like your faculty advisor was sort of just the one-stop shop for all of those things. But at the same time, you depending on that like relationship that you have with that advisor, like um the relationship really could make or break how much support you received from your advisor. And so yeah, those were also like pieces to navigate. Um when we talk about other resources that or support structures from Michael's question. In my experience, I I think back and I'm also really grateful that I got connected to ACPA in my first year of grad school, and also specifically ACPA's um, Next Generation Institute. At the time, I was able to attend when Next Generation Institute was open to both graduate students and undergraduate students. And then also ACPA's Asian Pacific American Network. There was uh, I I will say that I currently serve as one of the co-chairs for that network for APAN. Oh, this is also a shameless plug, but like one of the programs that I experienced then and we still host now is our APITA Scholars Collective, where we have different scholars within our APITA community, Asian Pacific Islander, Desi American, um, community who offer to have either in-person or virtual office hours around the time of convention with members of our community. And those office hours are opportunities to talk about things such as like doctoral research interests, applying to doctoral programs, applying to master's programs, navigating different aspects of your personal like life transitions, personal identities, and uh, with like different professional transitions that you could be experiencing too. I think it was from those experiences that reminded me that like the way I was going to get through all the things that were like giving me whiplash and throwing me for a whirlwind in graduate school was being connected to community. And so there was that. I also this is an observation that I noted after my time in graduate school, but I noted that because of my peers, my colleagues, graduate experiences, either in master's or doctoral programs, but how like different graduate student collectives across the country were protesting, particularly for cost of living increases in their compensation, how they were advocating for better workplace standards, for more guidance to university administration to prevent like the exploitation of graduate student labor, and even for unionization. And those were all, so like when I reflect back on my own graduate student experiences, were those things that I definitely experienced? Yes. Were there support structures in place to address those experiences at the time? No. But I also think that that we're seeing a shift in how like the graduate student experience, particularly for, well, no, the graduate student experience is shifting, and I think it's shifting in a way that is better accommodating and addressing some of these experiences that first generation graduate students went through during the time when I went to graduate school.
Thank you both for sharing those perspectives. I can sense from both of those perspectives that like there were definitely a lot of challenges, but at the same time there were some support systems in place to support you. I really like the idea. I think Will, you had mentioned it, community, and I heard a little bit of that idea coming from Nick's perspective as well. I'm glad that you had brought up ACPA because I want to transition into that next. And so you'd already mentioned it a little bit, Will. But since this podcast is partly sponsored by ACPA, we are just curious to know, like, in what ways from your individual ACPA involvements have you seen the association play a role in supporting first generation graduate students in the field? I know you both have very different, or a lot of different ways you're involved with ACPA, so I'd love to hear how those involvements have shaped your growth within the field. And Will, I'll let you go ahead and start.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely think a lot of my experiences, well, oh my gosh, where are my words? A lot of my experiences with ACPA and first generation graduate student support has really boiled down to or like become focused in initiatives that we see from the entities in ACPA. There's the Graduate Students and New Professionals Community of Practice, but then also different commissions and also different coalitions and networks have really leaned into like programs that and initiatives that really like tie into the collectivist approach of like some of the cultures that our identities are connected with in order to yeah, address like first generation graduate student support from those lens. So I talked about earlier, like with APAN, our PETA Scholars Collective, and but I also think that with ACPA's, I I will say, like, when I was reflecting on this question, I think about this um I guess like connection I'm drawing between how uh, ACPA's strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization um, I've seen it start to come out in practice with conversations we're having in the coalitions and networks level, and how it intersects with the like research and scholarship area of the ACPA Leadership Council in breaking down some of the um, uh, is it breaking down? Maybe it's more so like reimagining um, how like research and scholarship can look within higher education. Um, Us podcasting right now is an example of that. It's not the same as like a as a peer-reviewed journal article, but at the same time, like we are pooling together our knowledge. We are also like making our knowledge and experiences through storytelling accessible for our audience. And so um, I definitely think that yeah, that's just a theme that I see that's really driven by ACPA's values. Um, and yeah, those are some of the things that came up for me when I was thinking about this question.
Yeah, thank you. I really like that idea of kind of like reimagining how we can share our ideas and share our research even through these like untraditional lenses, right? And how that's becoming a more accessible way to approach conversations like this. So thank you. Um, Nick, I'd love to hear what you'd add to this part.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first got involved with ACPA, I pretty much jumped headfirst into the graduate students and new professionals community of practice. So I initially began as an ACPA ambassador. That was my first semester of graduate school. So I really just got to learn about what ACPA entailed because, to be honest, I kind of just joined without really knowing too much about what it was. And so that really allowed me to connect with a lot of folks who work in student affairs, work in higher ed, that were at very similar spots in their life as I was. So being an ACPA ambassador, I really was able to just meet other people, meet folks who've been involved with the commission for or community longer than I have, and really just kind of have that support system as I started graduate school. Um, I was placed actually, they're called clusters. I was placed in a cluster with one of someone I've worked with a lot over the past few years. I've presented with them at different conferences at ACPA. I've presented with them at NACADA. Like I've just really gotten involved with folks from GSNP. Um, and in general, I think ACPA just really does a great job with making sure folks in the organization just feel supported. Especially, for example, focusing on first generation graduate students. I think just with the amount of webinars that go on, with the amount of different learning opportunities, they just sent out the email about the pre-convention workshops, and those would all be fantastic for first gen grad students to attend. Um, I just think that thinking of my experience and thinking about like how I've progressed in student affairs, I really don't think I would be where I'm at today without ACPA's support, to be honest. Now I'm on the directorate for GSNP. I'm also on the directorate board for ACPA in Michigan. So I'm just really kind of getting to know a lot of really great folks from around my state, but as well as around the country. And it's just been a really great experience to see how how I was a few years ago, being able to instill that in folks now who are in their first year of grad school. Now that I'm a year out of my master's, I've kind of gotten my feet wet in the field a little bit, and it's really cool to see the kind of the flip side of that. And then for the ACP ambassador program, it's kind of transitioned into more of a convention ambassador program, and I was able to actually spearhead that, and I was able to be the one that really put that program together. So it's been a really cool way to see how much I have changed over the last few years. And I'm sure a lot of other first generation graduate students feel the same way, just through their involvement in ACPA. it's been really rewarding, honestly, to say the least.
Yeah, I guess I'm hearing both of you wanting to give back what you received and
Hmm.
also make sure people get the things that you didn't get, right? I wish I would have had this and wanted to offer that, which I think is how a lot of student affairs professionals, right? They had a really great experience and they want to give that back, or they didn't have a good experience and they want to make sure others have a better experience. I wonder if we could hear from each of you, and Nick, we'll start with you. We've talked a little bit about thoughts that you have for first generation graduate students to navigate, be involved, be committed, don't be over involved, don't be over committed, be involved in some of these ACPA things. It's a wonderful way to get connected, community and resources, so much good stuff. What would you offer to professionals who are working with first generation graduate students? This might be advisors, this might be faculty working with first generation grad students. What would you offer them from your perspective that would help them better serve the students they're so committed to?
Yeah, definitely. When reflecting on this question, I think my brain immediately went to just remembering that these students are people first. They may be in your classroom, they may be your employee, they may be your colleague, whatever it might
Mhm.
be. Graduate students are often holding so many different positions, kind of like I said, so many different involvements. A lot of them hold part-time jobs off campus.
Mhm.
Like a lot of students have a lot of things going on in their life. So I think for professionals working with first generation graduate students, just remember to be flexible, willing to listen. As I mentioned, the students in these positions, they might say they know what they're doing. They might not know what they're doing as someone who has been in that exact same boat.
Mm.
So just really being able to be a resource for these students that you're working with. Um, I also think it's important to remember that if you know that that the student is a first generation graduate student, that's not like a catch-all identity for that student. I
Yeah.
think that being first generation means different things for different people. Some people might need that extra support where they're like, yes, I am going to ask you so many questions. I am going to need you to walk me through this, whatever it might be. There are going to be other students who are like, I got this. Like, I'm here to do it. I feel confident in the work I'm doing. And that's okay too. I think that there's different ways that students can kind of present themselves in these spaces. And when you lump them all into one, I think that can just create a community that's not really working as best as it can be. And that kind of goes back to my first point of just remembering that, like, just get to know the people instead of just thinking of them as an employee or just thinking of them as a student. Because that can be really detrimental to your team or really draining to the student. We're all just people in this world, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Yeah. So recognize that they're human beings and people, tend to this identity, but also recognize that it's not their only identity and don't essentialize them. Those are three
Yep.
great suggestions. Well, what would you add?
Yeah, I had some similar thoughts when I was like reflecting on this question. Um, but I guess like I will I just packaged it packaged it in different ways, I guess.
Mhm.
I really want to affirm a lot of the things that Nick was saying. One of the things in terms of like acknowledging our whole persons. And I will say prior to my current position, I've only worked professionally at private Jesuit institutions. So this really comes from that Jesuit lens too. But Cura Personalis, like we in Res Life, we tell our students that you are human before you are a student. You're human first, student second, like RA third.
Mhm.
And here I would translate that to like we are human first, we are student second, and then we are our professional selves. Um, and so, but like when we are in a different chapter of our lives, in graduate school, um, how we define like the different dimensions of our of that human experience looks very different than maybe like what are some of the things we stereotype for like the traditional undergraduate student. So recognizing that there could be a much greater diversity of life experiences among our graduate student population. Um, to that degree, I also think that like when providing support to a first generation graduate student, um, that also as much as there are many experiences that will be like new to us, that doesn't mean that they are completely foreign to us. It just means that we haven't yet drawn the connections to like maybe some life experiences that we may already have. So I think it's important to ask what the student that you are working with knows first about a certain process. Before going into an explanation, like really treating the advising support from an anti-deficit lens. Um, and but also trying to um, break down the issue past the higher ed jargon, past the higher ed systems, and think about like how would you explain this issue to um, um, uh, um, how would you really break down this issue and explain it to um, like uh, a younger person um, and um, and then like see if there's any kind of like um, if there's any kind of life experience that the student you're working with can connect to on that level. Um, with that said, also taking some time to understand different learning styles. As we are seeing differences in learning styles and also different characteristics, generational characteristics of undergrad students. That means we're going to see different generational characteristics of grad students as those undergrads become grads. Um, and there could be some intergenerational like uh, learning and meaning making happening in the classroom as well, depending on like at what point in someone's life is someone like going back to school. Um, uh, I think I I also have a note here of acknowledging like why things are what they are. Just because like something is the way that it is because of how academia and the academy has like set it to be, doesn't mean that like when these graduate students eventually graduate and have tools that the tools equipped, they're equipped with the tools that they gained from their degree. That doesn't mean that they have to perpetuate it per se either. And so also being open to how first generation graduate students can imagine different possibilities too. So uh, I Yeah, I think we also have to remember that like our systems of higher education are rooted in like foundations of neoliberalism, white supremacy, and um, oh, there was one other I forgot, but like those are all the foundation to the systems that we operate in with and I would like to imagine that with um, all of the work that ACPA is doing to boldly transform higher education, that everyone watching or listening to this episode and working with first generation graduate students, we also need to think about how our support will actively um, like combat some of those systems that we've been conditioned in or like leave room for new possibilities too.
Yeah, I appreciate that systemic analysis and also the jargon. I think one of the ways jargon fits into is just the acronyms we use. That's another sort of form of jargon. So, Michael, let's move us to wrapping up.
Yeah, so we're running a little bit out of time, but this podcast is called Student Affairs Now. So we just would like to end the conversation by just asking, what are you thinking about, or what's on your mind, what's troubling you, or you're pondering about? It could be related to this conversation or just anything else that is currently on your mind. And if you would like to give yourself a plug, where could listeners find you?
Yeah, I think something that I've been thinking about throughout this conversation is just a lot about that support side of things for first generation college students and graduate students. So as I'm, getting started with this doctoral program, I'm obviously working full time on campus, so my experience is going to be a little bit different than someone who's, doing a doc program with an assistantship or doing different work. But I'm just really thinking about how and what support systems are available, and I think that needs to be a larger conversation in the world of higher ed and student affairs. So something that I've been thinking with. When it comes to a shameless plug, I'm never afraid to do one of those. Um, LinkedIn is my go-to. Just look up my name. There's only so many Nick Melendowskis in the world. And then emails nmalendo@emish.edu. But once again, just look up my name, can't miss it.
For me, I think like I will preface this is not fully related to this podcast topic, but it is, and in some ways it can be. I think what I'm really thinking about is how our field is experiencing, in general, lower enrollment numbers for graduate student programs. And as we reimagine and like sort of target how we, I guess, the pipelines in which how we bring students through like higher ed graduate preparation programs and ultimately into the field as our future colleagues. Like how many in what ways can we make sure that first generation graduate student support is a foundation for whatever initiatives that that are coming to mind, that are being developed. So yeah, I will definitely leave it there because that is very much like also tied to the future of our field. In terms of where folks can connect with me to especially like continue conversations like these, LinkedIn is also a great place to connect with me. I wish I wish I had the same uniqueness as Nick in terms of like how searchable I am on LinkedIn. There are quite a lot of Will Shoes out there in the world, but I think I am the only Will Shoe I know in higher education, student affairs. So hopefully, my tagline will make it a lot easier to filter myself out from all the search results.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much again for being a part of this conversation. Really thinking about a lot of different things right now. So I'm going to continue thinking about this. But Keith, I'll send it to you to wrap us out.
Yeah, thank you to all of you for being here and for your leadership in this space. This has been really great. And we also want to thank our sponsor of today's episode, ACPA. ACPA, College Student Educators International, is celebrating its 100th anniversary and is boldly transforming higher education by creating and sharing influential scholarship, shaping critically reflective practice, and advocating for equitable and inclusive learning environments. ACPA aspires to be higher education's and student affairs' most inclusive and community-driven association by leading our profession in centering social justice, racial justice, and decolonization as defining concepts of our time and the foreseeable future. Visit myacpa.org or connect with them on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and to learn more about ACPA. As always, a huge shout out to our producer, Nat Ambrosi, who does all the behind the scenes work to make us all look and sound good. We love your support for these important conversations. You can help us reach even more folks by subscribing to the podcast on YouTube and our weekly newsletter, where you can learn about each new episode on Wednesday mornings. If you're so inclined, you can leave us a 5-star review. It really helps these conversations reach a larger audience. I'm Keith Edwards with Michael Allman. Thanks again to our amazing guests today and to everyone who is watching and listening. Take good care of yourselves and honor your wisdom and spirit. Thanks, everybody.